In the spring of 1834, in the quiet hills of central Virginia, police forced open the cellar door of a seemingly ordinary farmhouse and uncovered what would become one of the darkest true crime secrets in American history: 47 children, chained in silence beneath the earth. What emerged from that darkness was not simply a tale of kidnapping or cruelty, but a hidden network of human trafficking so vast it would shatter the illusion of safety in rural America and echo across generations. These were not just missing children. They were victims trapped in a living nightmare orchestrated by a woman the locals knew only as Mother Sullivan. Some spoke different languages. None were related. And when questioned, all they could whisper through trembling lips was that single name, as if it alone explained the horrors endured. The sheriff's report, buried in dusty archives for over a century, described scenes so grotesque that 3 lawmen resigned within a week, unable to carry the memories. This wasn't just the dark history of a single family. It was a chilling reminder of how pure evil can hide behind respectable facades, operating for over 2 decades undetected in a close-knit community. And the question that still chills historians and true crime obsessives today is how many other Sullivan farms might still lie buried beneath the quiet hills of America, hiding horrors we dare not imagine. This is the story of the Sullivan Farm, a tale of hidden horrors, America's darkest secrets, and the monstrous reality that sometimes the worst evils come disguised as kindness. Sometimes the most ordinary places hide the darkest secrets. And in the spring of 1834 in the rolling hills of Virginia, one farmhouse transformed from a quiet piece of rural life into the scene of one of America's most horrifying true crime discoveries. This wasn't just another headline in the annals of dark history. It was a revelation so chilling. It has haunted historians and true crime investigators for nearly 2 centuries. Nestled among fields of tobacco and corn, the Sullivan property looked just like any other farm, the kind of place you'd pass on a dusty road without a second glance. But beneath its floorboards lay a secret that would force even hardened lawmen to question the limits of human cruelty. 47 children, shackled in the shadows, hidden from the world as though they'd never existed. They were different ages, spoke different languages. And when the authorities demanded to know who they were, the only words any of them could whisper, trembling, were Mother Sullivan. The images that greeted Sheriff Benjamin Crawford and his deputy on that day were described as a sight so gruesome that the air itself seemed to choke with the weight of despair. For over 20 years, an unassuming farmhouse had been the hub of a sinister network, a labyrinth of stone walls and iron rings where innocent children were kept like cattle, stripped not only of freedom, but of hope. And yet, until the moment the cellar doors were forced open, the community of Millbrook believed they lived beside a woman of charity and Christian compassion. How did such monstrous evil go unseen for so long? How many secrets still lie buried beneath the hills of Virginia, waiting to be unearthed? These questions continue to spark the obsession of those who seek out hidden horrors and America's darkest secrets. Because sometimes, the worst monsters wear the softest smiles, and sometimes the name Mother Sullivan is all it takes to send shivers crawling up your spine. This isn't just a story from the past, it's a warning that in the places we least suspect, darkness can grow unchecked, waiting for the moment it bursts into the light. But what if I told you that behind white clapboard walls and wraparound porches, beneath the gentle sway of Virginia pines, there once existed a place so horrifying that even the bravest men who entered would never sleep soundly again? It wasn't just another farmhouse. It was a perfect facade for the kind of evil that slips unnoticed through polite society. To any traveler rolling down the dusty road from Richmond to Millbrook in 1834, the Sullivan farm looked like a piece of the American dream, a tidy homestead, acres of fertile land, and a reputation for generosity. But inside its bones, something unspeakable was happening. For over 2 decades, life around Millbrook went on as usual, tobacco fields rustling in the wind, church bells echoing through the valleys, families gathering at Henderson's general store to share gossip about crops and politics. And yet all the while, beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, There was the sound of chains rattling in the darkness. A sound muffled by thick stone walls, designed not just to keep secrets in, but to keep hope out. The neighbors remembered Constance Sullivan as a woman of soft voice and gentle ways, who dressed modestly and spoke often of Christian charity. She'd come from Pennsylvania as a young bride, telling stories of orphans who needed homes, explaining away the extra food she purchased every 2 weeks, or the shy glimpses of small faces peering from the back of her wagon. And no one asked further questions. Because who wants to believe that a woman known for charity could be capable of something monstrous? But history has a cruel way of reminding us that the worst nightmares often wear the kindest smiles. How could so many people have lived beside a place where children were caged like animals and never noticed the truth? How many other Mother Sullivans have stood smiling among us? Secrets locked behind cellar doors. This is why even today, the name Mother Sullivan is whispered in certain circles as a symbol of hidden horrors, dark secrets, and the chilling reality that evil often thrives precisely where we're too polite or too terrified to look. And as we peel back the layers of the Sullivan story, remember this: the true terror isn't just what was done, but how easily it was hidden in plain sight, because the most terrifying evil is the one that grows unnoticed, feeding on trust, thriving in the shadows of ordinary life. For 20 years, Constance Sullivan wove a tapestry of deception so perfect that even neighbors who lived mere yards away never suspected the darkness concealed behind her gentle smiles. She played her role so flawlessly that when someone questioned the extra barrels of flour, the crates of salt pork, the jars of molasses she bought in quantities far too large for a childless couple, she simply explained it away with talk of orphans and charity. And who would dare to doubt the kindly woman who attended church when her health allowed, who spoke softly and wore simple dresses? Because in 1834, Virginia, appearances were everything. And appearances were exactly what Constance Sullivan used as her weapon. What no one knew was that beneath the bright white siding of the Sullivan house lay a maze of stone and iron designed not for food storage, but for captivity. While other families stored root vegetables and preserves in their cellars, the Sullivans were building a prison. Local craftsmen recalled being paid generously, but always in cash, and never allowed to see the full project. Each man built only a section, believing it was an innocent improvement for storing crops. Yet piece by piece, the perfect cage was born. And it worked because nobody wants to believe that horror could live so close. That's how monsters survive. By hiding in plain sight. So the people of Millbrook continued to gossip about politics, harvests, and the occasional scandal, blissfully ignorant that in the farmhouse at the edge of town, dozens of children were chained to iron rings, their cries smothered by thick stone walls, and all the while, Constance Sullivan moved among them, a woman praised for her compassion, while beneath her feet, the echoes of sobs and the scrape of chains told a story no one dared to imagine. It's why today, for those who study America's dark history, the name Mother Sullivan stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest atrocities unfold behind the most ordinary doors, and that evil often wears the mask of virtue. It's terrifying how close you can stand to evil without ever realizing it. Because in Millbrook, Virginia, everyone believed they knew Constance Sullivan. She was the woman with the dark hair tucked neatly beneath a bonnet, the soft voice that never rose above a polite whisper, the neighbor who handed out bread to grieving families and gave coins to the church fund. She moved through life cloaked in the illusion of charity, a perfect disguise that blinded an entire community to the nightmare growing beneath her feet. To the townsfolk, she was simply Mrs. Sullivan, the woman who claimed to be caring for orphans from Pennsylvania. And in an era ravaged by high mortality and orphaned children, who would question a woman offering shelter to the lost and abandoned. But that's exactly how monsters hide in the familiar, in the places we least suspect. And every time someone noticed the way Constance bought far more food than any childless couple could possibly consume, she explained it away with soft eyes and tragic tales of children who had lost everything. Every time a child's pale face flickered at the edge of the wagon, only to vanish behind burlap curtains, Constance would lower her voice and speak of trauma, of how the children were too frightened to speak, too scarred to face strangers, and everyone believed her. because it was easier to accept the story of a kindly woman helping orphans than to entertain the possibility that right there, in the middle of their community, a horror beyond imagination was unfolding. How many of us, even today, are living beside secrets we'd rather not see? How many Mother Sullivans stand smiling across fences and in supermarket aisles, hiding darkness behind gentle words? That's the danger of trusting appearances. It's why true crime stories like this grip us so tightly, because they remind us that the line between normal life and unspeakable horror can be as thin as a smile and as soft as a whispered "God bless you." Because evil doesn't always announce itself with blood and screams. Sometimes it arrives softly, wrapped in flour sacks and molasses barrels. Every 2 weeks, Constance Sullivan stepped into Henderson's general store, moving with the quiet certainty of a woman on a mission. She carried a folded list, written in tidy script, and ordered enough provisions to feed a household far larger than any the townsfolk believed she kept. Sacks of cornmeal, barrels of flour, cured pork, salt by the dozen pounds, jars of molasses that gleamed like dark, syrupy secrets. Thomas Henderson, the shopkeeper, watched her closely over the years. He'd ask, politely, why a childless couple needed so much food. And every time, Constance would lower her eyes, voice trembling just enough to sound genuine, and murmur about children rescued from tragedy, children who needed care, who needed healing. She was always ready with the perfect explanation. And that's how darkness survives, by seeming normal. The townspeople wanted to believe her. It was easier than imagining that the woman who stood beside them in church, who gently nodded at neighbors in passing, could be harboring a secret so monstrous it defied sanity. And that's the problem with evil hidden in plain sight. It feeds off our desire for normalcy. Constance didn't just buy food. She bought medicine, basic remedies for coughs, fever powders, even tinctures strong enough to sedate. Henderson noticed the volumes increasing over the years. Yet whenever curiosity flickered in his eyes, Constance met it with stories of children sick with grief and malnutrition, children whose frail bodies required special care, and who would dare challenge the narrative of a woman claiming to save orphans. But somewhere in those quiet transactions, in the shuffle of coin and the rustle of paper lists, lay the faint echo of chains rattling beneath the floorboards of the Sullivan farmhouse. Because in true crime, the worst horrors often wear the mask of charity. And the question that lingers, like a chill in the air, is this: how many other smiling faces are buying extra sacks of flour right now, hiding horrors we cannot imagine? Because sometimes the most dangerous thing about evil is how ordinary it looks from the outside. Neighbors in Millbrook remembered seeing Constance Sullivan arrive in town, a slender woman in her early 20s, newly married, with eyes that seemed almost too soft, too gentle to belong to someone capable of cruelty. She wore simple dresses, spoke modestly, and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that made people trust her without question. And maybe that's why no one looked too closely when strange things started happening around the Sullivan farm. There were fleeting glimpses of children's faces, pale and silent, peering out from the back of the Sullivan wagon as Constance rode through town for supplies. But before anyone could wave or speak, the children vanished behind curtains or ducked out of sight. Mrs. Henderson at the general store remembered the way one small boy seemed ready to cry until Constance reached back and gently pressed a finger to her lips, a silent warning that said more than words ever could. And in a place like Millbrook, where tragedy and loss were woven into everyday life, people were willing to accept Constance's explanations. She said the children were orphans from Pennsylvania, traumatized by death and disaster, shy to the point of silence. And no one wanted to believe that kindness might be a mask for horror, because it was easier to believe in charity than to entertain the idea that in their own peaceful community, something unspeakable was happening right under their noses. How many times do we tell ourselves that it couldn't happen here? Even as the shadows grow longer behind closed doors, Constance Sullivan's genius wasn't just in her cruelty. It was in how perfectly she constructed a narrative the town wanted to believe. She wrapped her secrets in the language of compassion, spoke of God's work, and cultivated a reputation that shielded her from suspicion. And all the while, the chains clinked softly in the dark beneath her house. That's why even today, in the world of true crime, the story of Mother Sullivan resonates so powerfully because it forces us to ask whether we're truly safe, or simply choosing not to see the horrors lurking in plain sight. Because the greatest horror is realizing you're alone in seeing the truth, and no one wants to believe you. The first true fracture in the Sullivan facade came on a bitter February night in 1834, when a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern found himself caught in a raging snowstorm between Richmond and Charlottesville. Desperate for shelter, he spotted the warm glow of lanterns flickering behind frosted windows at the Sullivan farm. It seemed like salvation, a safe haven in a deadly storm. But once inside, Jacob sensed that something was profoundly wrong. Constance Sullivan served cornbread and salt pork with hands that trembled just a little too much, while Ezra Sullivan stared at the floor, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as if he were waiting for some hidden danger to spring. Conversation was sparse, punctuated by uncomfortable silences that felt heavy enough to crush the air from the room. But it was in the dead of night, as snow battered the wooden siding, that Jacob Stern heard it, a muffled sound rising up from beneath the floorboards. It was a sound no blizzard could explain, soft, high-pitched crying that pulsed like a heartbeat in the darkness. When Jacob asked about the noise, Ezra Sullivan's voice grew tight, insisting it was nothing but the wind howling through old timbers. And in that moment, Jacob faced a truth that so many in true crime stories have faced before, that to speak up meant becoming isolated, labeled a troublemaker, dismissed as imagining shadows where none existed. Because who would believe that a pillar of the community could be hiding dozens of children beneath their feet? How do you convince a town that evil might live next door, behind the same walls where prayers are whispered and kindness is displayed? So Jacob left the next morning, snow melting off his coat as he stepped back into a world determined not to see. And the cries he heard in the dark became just another secret carried along the dusty roads of Virginia. It's why true crime stories like this haunt us so deeply, because they remind us how easy it is to feel powerless, to stand alone in the face of unspeakable horror, and to wonder how many other cries go unheard beneath the floorboards of houses we think we know. Because there's nothing more chilling than knowing someone has vanished and realizing you might be the only one who cares enough to look. Just 3 weeks after Jacob Stern's haunted visit, another name would become forever tied to the darkness surrounding the Sullivan farm: Mary Catherine Flynn. A young Irish immigrant. Mary Catherine was traveling with her family, hoping to find work in the tobacco fields near Richmond. But during a treacherous river crossing, she became separated from her parents and siblings, swept away in confusion and winter cold, alone, terrified, and shivering. Mary Catherine stumbled through the Virginia wilderness until she saw a familiar sight: the white-clapboard house of Constance Sullivan. To a frightened young girl, it must have seemed like a beacon of hope, but what she found inside those walls was not salvation. It was a doorway into the very heart of a nightmare. Constance Sullivan welcomed her with warm words, offered her food, spoke gently of helping her find her family. No one ever saw Mary Catherine Flynn alive again. And that's how evil works. It doesn't always strike with screams and violence. Sometimes it whispers comfort while quietly sealing your fate. When Mary's family realized she was missing, they searched the frozen countryside until exhaustion and fear forced them to accept the unthinkable. The official story became that Mary likely died of exposure or was taken by wild animals, a tragedy. Yes, but nothing sinister. But the truth was far darker. Locked away beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, chained alongside dozens of other children whose faces no one else would ever know. And this is the tragedy of true crime, not just the acts themselves, but how easily they disappear beneath the surface of everyday life. How many Mary Catherine Flynns vanish every year, chalked up to random misfortune, while the real monsters keep hiding behind respectable doors. It's the reason stories like this haunt us, because they force us to wonder, are we ever truly safe, or is safety just a story we tell ourselves to sleep at night? while horrors unfold behind closed doors. Because sometimes, the only thing separating a quiet life from unimaginable horror is a single decision to look closer or to look away. For William Hutchinson, that decision came on a crisp April morning in 1834, a local farmer and hunter. William set out into the woods bordering the Sullivan property, his rifle slung across his shoulder, intent on chasing rabbits through the underbrush. He never expected to stumble upon the thin, wavering cries that would forever shatter the illusion of peace in Millbrook. At first, he thought he was imagining it a distant wail carried by the wind, but the sound grew clearer, more desperate. Not the playful laughter of children at a schoolyard, but the raw, ragged shrieks of souls trapped in terror, hiding behind a stand of oak trees just 50 yards from the Sullivan farmhouse. William strained his ears, his breath catching as the screams rose and fell, always seeming to come from beneath the earth. It was the sound of captivity, the sound of children begging for a rescue that might never come. As he crouched there, heart pounding, William saw Ezra Sullivan emerge from a cellar door half hidden along the side of the house. Ezra's head snapped left and right, eyes darting over the fields as though checking for witnesses, before he slipped back underground and shut the door behind him. And in that moment, William Hutchinson knew he was staring into the abyss of something monstrous. But he also knew the weight of suspicion in a small town, where rumors could ruin a man as quickly as a plague. Because how do you convince neighbors that the friendly woman they praise for her Christian charity might be a jailer, a trafficker, a predator hiding children like property in a cellar, yet some truths burn too hot to be contained? William couldn't look away. And that's why in true crime, heroes aren't always the ones with badges. They're sometimes just ordinary people who refuse to ignore the cries in the dark. It's what makes stories like Mother Sullivan's so terrifying and so vital to remember. Because evil counts on our silence. And the question is, how many cries are echoing beneath our feet right now, waiting for someone brave enough to listen? Because there's a moment in every horror story when denial dies and the truth tears through your mind like a blade. For Sheriff Benjamin Crawford and his deputy Marcus Webb, that moment arrived on the morning of April 8, 1834. They rode out to the Sullivan farm under the pale glow of dawn, half expecting to quiet neighborhood gossip, half praying that all the whispers were nothing more than superstition. But as soon as they stepped onto the Sullivan property, the air seemed to tighten around them, heavy with something unseen but unmistakably wrong. Constance Sullivan greeted them at the door, her voice syrupy sweet, her hands clasped in polite concern. She spoke of sick children resting inside, of letters from Pennsylvania relatives arranging permanent homes. Her words dripped with practiced compassion, every syllable calculated to disarm suspicion. But the true horror was waiting just beyond the walls, clawing at the edges of the officer's senses. When Deputy Webb asked to use the privy and circled around the house, he saw at the cellar door William Hutchinson had described, secured by 3 padlocks, iron chains twisted so tightly that splinters of wood gouged the frame. And worst of all, were the deep gouges and scratch marks clawed into the wood, as if someone or many someones had tried to dig their way out with bare, bleeding fingers. It was the physical proof that the darkness lurking beneath the Sullivan farm was real, and far more monstrous than anyone had dared to imagine. Returning inside, Webb whispered what he'd seen. Sheriff Crawford turned to Constance Sullivan, demanding to inspect the cellar. In that instant, her mask cracked. The woman who had fooled an entire town for over 2 decades turned pale, her voice dissolving into stammers, her eyes darting toward the kitchen floor as if searching for an escape hatch back into her lies. And that's when the muffled sound rose from beneath their feet, a chorus of sobs, fragile voices crying for help, the sound of 47 children imprisoned in darkness. In that instant, the true scale of the nightmare slammed into Crawford's mind, splintering the thin barrier between the world he thought he knew and the monstrous reality now staring back at him. This wasn't just hidden evil. It was an empire of suffering, constructed stone by stone, lie by lie, over 20 silent years. And the question that would haunt him forever was simple and devastating. How many other monsters have we let hide in plain sight, simply because they wore the face of kindness, because sometimes the truth is so monstrous? It doesn't just change what you know, it destroys what you believe is possible. Sheriff Crawford, face pale as linen, gripped the handle of the cellar door while Deputy Webb smashed through the padlocks, each strike echoing like a death knell across the fields. When the final chain clattered to the dirt, the heavy wooden door swung open, exhaling a blast of fetid air so vile it seemed to choke the sun itself. The smell wasn't merely rot, it was something deeper, something human, a stench of despair and filth that wrapped itself around your soul and refused to let go. Descending the steps into blackness, Crawford and Webb held lanterns trembling in their hands. The flickering glow illuminated walls of stone, painstakingly mortared to muffle sound, forming chambers that extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. It wasn't a basement, it was a labyrinth designed for one purpose: imprisonment. And then the light fell upon the children. 47 of them. Gaunt faces streaked with filth, eyes hollow and empty of hope. Shackled to iron rings driven deep into stone walls. Chains rattled as they shifted. Too weak even to cry out, some clutching each other in silent terror. This was not merely cruelty, it was architecture engineered for suffering. Many children were so emaciated they seemed carved from bone, their skin clinging to ribs, sores blossoming like dark flowers on feverish flesh. The silence was worse than any scream, because in that quiet, you could feel the weight of years, the crushing certainty that these children had forgotten the sun, forgotten freedom, forgotten that life could be anything but cold stone and iron chains. Deputy Webb vomited into the dirt floor, his shoulders shaking as he tried to comprehend how any human could orchestrate such horror. Sheriff Crawford's vision swam with tears, yet he forced himself to study every inch of the room because knowing was now a duty, no matter how much it shattered him. And in that darkness, amid ragged breathing and rattling chains, Crawford realized a truth that would haunt him forever. This wasn't just one woman's madness. This was a carefully built empire of human misery, hidden beneath the mask of charity, and it could happen anywhere. Because there comes a point when horror stops feeling like a story and becomes a wound you carry forever. Sheriff Crawford and Deputy Webb pushed deeper into the subterranean warren, lantern light casting monstrous shadows on stone walls slick with dampness. Each step felt like a descent into madness. Because this wasn't just a hidden basement, it was a machine built for human suffering. And as they entered a narrower chamber, the truth clawed at what was left of their sanity. Here, they found not just tools of imprisonment, but implements of punishment. Wooden stocks stained dark with old blood. Iron cuffs bolted to low benches. Instruments fashioned to restrain, to silence, to break spirits. It was cruelty turned into science. In another room, they discovered shelves stacked with ledgers meticulously recording names, ages, dates of arrival, and chilling notes about each child's behavior and physical condition. There were columns labeled compliant, difficult, requires discipline. It read like an account book for livestock, except the commodity was human lives. And it was this cold organization that tore through Crawford's mind like a blade, because monsters weren't simply deranged. They were methodical, calculated, businesslike. Worse still was the realization that the Sullivans had been operating for over 20 years, and that more than 90 children had passed through these chambers. The burning question crashed into Crawford's chest like a hammer. Where were the rest? The answer lay in a passage so narrow they had to crawl on hands and knees. There, in a final chamber, lay the shallow graves of at least 36 children, tiny bodies covered in quicklime to slow decay. Some had died from disease or malnutrition, others showed signs of violent ends. It wasn't just murder. It was systematic erasure. As though these children had never existed at all. And this is what makes stories like the Sullivan Farm so devastating, because they reveal how easily evil can camouflage itself as ordinary life, how thorough and silent a predator can be. and how human beings can transform cruelty into an industry. Crawford stared into that mass grave and felt his faith in humanity fracture. Because the ultimate horror wasn't just that these children were killed, but that they were catalogued, priced, and traded like merchandise. And that somewhere out there, other ledgers might still exist, waiting to be found. Because sometimes, the most terrifying part of a monster's lair isn't the blood on the floor, but the paperwork on the shelves. Sheriff Crawford, fighting to steady his breathing, flipped through those ledgers as Deputy Webb held the lantern higher, the flickering light catching rows of careful handwriting. Each page was a ledger of lives stolen, a meticulous catalog of children reduced to transactions, their humanity stripped away with the stroke of a quill. Beside names and ages were stark columns labeled value, condition, and horrifyingly, purpose. Some entries read like livestock assessments: healthy, obedient, suitable for domestic service. Others were marked with brutal coldness: unruly, excessive crying, consider disposal. And it was in those words that Crawford felt the final fracture of his faith in human decency. Because this wasn't random violence, it was business. A hidden industry operating under the noses of neighbors who had trusted Constance Sullivan as a pillar of Christian charity. And that's what twisted the knife deeper. The realization that evil didn't just hide in shadows, it thrived in ledgers, in polite conversations, in the silence of good people unwilling to ask questions. Even more devastating was what the ledgers revealed next: references to contacts beyond Virginia. Names and locations scattered across multiple states, a web of trafficking stretching from Pennsylvania to Georgia, disguised as charity work, fueled by greed. It wasn't just the Sullivan farm, it was a network, a sprawling conspiracy built on stolen childhoods and secret profits. And at its center stood a woman known to the world as Mother Sullivan, whose soft voice and gentle eyes masked a predator's cunning. How many other basements hid the same horrors? How many children vanished into the cracks of a country too polite to look beneath the surface? It's these questions that make true crime stories like this feel radioactive, because they leave us wondering whether we'd have been brave enough to see the truth, or whether we'd have smiled politely, nodded at our neighbor, and let monsters build their empire in silence. And that, Sheriff Crawford realized, was the true horror: that monsters can be methodical, polite, and completely invisible until the day someone forces open the cellar door. Because the real horror of a story like this isn't just what was done, it's how long the echoes keep screaming, long after the cellar door has been shut. As news of the Sullivan discovery spread, Millbrook, once a quiet farming community, became a name whispered with a shiver across Virginia and beyond. Sheriff Crawford found himself at the center of a storm he could never have imagined. The details leaking out of the Sullivan basement were so monstrous that newspapers struggled to print them without igniting widespread panic. 3 of Crawford's own deputies resigned within days, unable to bear what they'd witnessed. Neighbors fell into bitter arguments, torn between those who still couldn't believe Constance Sullivan capable of such evil, and those who looked back and wondered how they had ever missed the signs. And that's the chilling truth about human nature sometimes. Even after the masks come off, people still refuse to see the monsters in front of them. Ezra Sullivan was arrested, his face twisted into a mask of grim resignation, while constant Mother Sullivan maintained her soft-spoken innocence until the very end. But even as arrests were made, the community felt a stain settling over every dusty road and whitewashed porch. Parents held their children tighter. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Because the question that clawed at everyone's minds was terrifyingly simple. How many other basements were hiding horrors waiting to be found? Investigators uncovered evidence connecting the Sullivan farm to buyers in states as far away as Georgia, revealing a vast trafficking network that had operated in secrecy for decades. The discovery triggered one of the first multi-state true crime investigations in American history, drawing federal marshals into a case that shattered illusions of safety in rural communities. And this is what makes stories like Mother Sullivan's so radioactive in true crime circles, not only because of what she did, but because of how expertly she disguised it. The quiet woman baking bread, praying in church, smiling politely at neighbors, was orchestrating an empire of human suffering. And that leaves us with the deepest, most haunting question of all. If such monstrous evil could hide so perfectly for 20 years in the heart of Virginia, how many other monsters are still out there, smiling at us from across the fence, waiting for the perfect moment to lock the cellar door once more? Because true horror doesn't end when the monster is caught. It lingers in the silence that follows, infecting every corner of the world we thought we knew. As the investigation into the Sullivan farm widened, the threads of the conspiracy stretched farther than even the most seasoned lawmen could have imagined. The ledgers found beneath the farmhouse exposed names, transactions, and coded letters hinting at buyers scattered from Pennsylvania to Georgia, each page a roadmap of human misery. But as authorities raced to track these connections, a wave of fear swept through Millbrook and beyond. People began questioning everything they thought they understood about their neighbors, their churches, and the sanctity of their own communities. Because once you learn that monsters can look like kindly women handing out bread at church, nothing feels safe anymore. Children who survived the Sullivan basement were moved under armed guard to secret locations for their protection. But the trauma they carried was far from hidden. Many couldn't speak for weeks, staring blankly at walls, flinching at any sudden movement. Some refused to let go of the shackles that had bound them, even when rescuers tried gently to remove them. Because after so many years in chains, freedom itself felt foreign and sometimes more terrifying than captivity. Sheriff Crawford, who had thought he'd seen the worst humanity could offer, now found himself haunted by new nightmares. He began suffering from insomnia, plagued by visions of pale faces peering from shadows, chains rattling in the silence of his empty office. And yet, even as he tried to push forward with the investigation, he found doors slamming shut in his face. Because not everyone wanted this truth exposed, not when it threatened powerful names and wealthy families across the South. Anonymous threats arrived at Crawford's office. Deputy Webb was ambushed on a dark road and nearly beaten to death. The medical records seized from the Sullivan farm revealed connections to medical professionals conducting unspeakable experiments on trafficked children. And the deeper the investigation dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just one farmhouse of horror, it was a system, a network, an entire industry feeding off stolen childhoods. And that's why the Sullivan story remains one of America's darkest true crime legends, because it leaves behind a single, horrifying thought echoing in the back of our minds. If this could happen for 20 years without anyone stopping it, what else is still hidden in the dark? Because even when the chains are broken, the echoes of suffering never truly fade. They crawl into the corners of memory, waiting to strike in the dark. For the survivors of the Sullivan basement, freedom arrived like a blinding light after decades spent in shadows. But freedom, they quickly discovered, doesn't erase the horrors burned into their minds. Doctors who examined the rescued children described them as ghosts in living bodies. Some stared at walls for hours, unable to process the idea that they were no longer prisoners. Others wept uncontrollably when offered food, as though kindness itself felt foreign and dangerous. Many were so malnourished that their bones seemed to protrude like wire beneath fragile skin. Infections raging through bodies that had been denied sunlight and fresh air for years. And the worst wounds were the ones no physician could touch, the invisible fractures in trust, hope, and any sense of safety. In interviews decades later, some survivors recalled how they had been told by Mother Sullivan that no one wanted them, that the outside world was crueler than the chains that bound them. This psychological prison was often harder to escape than the physical one. Rebecca, the young girl whose courage helped crack the entire case wide open, was placed with a quiet Quaker family in Pennsylvania. Though she eventually built a new life, married, and had children, she never again spoke publicly about the darkness she had endured. And that silence, historians say, might be the deepest scar left behind by the Sullivan case. Because true crime stories like this don't simply belong to the past, they linger in whispers, in rumors, in the spaces between what people say and what they're too afraid to say aloud. And the question that keeps survivors awake at night is one that haunts us all. If monsters could hide in plain sight for 20 years, wearing gentle smiles and speaking words of charity, how can we ever be certain we're safe? Or are the echoes of the Sullivan basement still out there, waiting for the next quiet house to swallow its secrets whole? Because in the end, the true legacy of monsters like Mother Sullivan isn't just the crimes they committed. It's the way they infect the world with doubt, fear, and silence. In the aftermath of the Sullivan discovery, laws began to change across Virginia and neighboring states. For the first time, child welfare became a matter of public policy rather than private charity. Orphanages came under scrutiny. Adoption processes demanded stricter oversight. But even as new rules were inked into law, the shadows of the Sullivan case loomed long and cold. Families who had once left doors unlocked now kept bolts fastened even in daylight. Strangers were no longer greeted with open arms. A lingering paranoia settled over communities that had once believed evil wore an obvious face. And that's how monsters win, not only through the harm they do, but through the fear they leave behind. Newspapers nationwide carried front-page stories of the horror at the Sullivan farm, each headline feeding a public both horrified and unable to look away. True crime had found one of its earliest legends, a story repeated in hushed tones, passed down like a ghost story to remind future generations that kindness can sometimes be camouflage for the unimaginable. Sheriff Crawford, promoted to federal marshal, dedicated the rest of his career to investigating crimes against children. Yet he was never the same man again. Those who knew him described how he'd fall silent at community gatherings, eyes distant, as though still hearing the echo of chains rattling beneath the earth. Because some truths carve scars too deep for time to ever fully heal. And that's why even now, nearly 2 centuries later, historians and true crime enthusiasts keep returning to the Sullivan case not just for the darkness it exposed, but for the warning it continues to deliver. Because if Mother Sullivan could hide such monstrous cruelty for 20 years, behind soft smiles and charitable deeds, then we have to wonder how many other smiling faces, even today, are guarding secrets so dark, they'd split our world apart if revealed. And that, more than any horror in a cellar, is what keeps us awake at night. Because stories like Mother Sullivan's remind us of a chilling truth that evil doesn't just destroy lives, it feeds on our silence and our willingness to look away. But you and I, right now, are proof that some people refuse to look away. We're the ones who dare to ask hard questions, who believe that shining light into the darkest corners can save lives even if it costs us our peace of mind. And maybe that's how we fight back, by remembering. By refusing to let monsters hide behind gentle smiles. By telling these stories, again and again, until the world can't ignore them. So if this story has haunted you or opened your eyes, drop a comment below and tell me, do you think there are secrets like this still waiting to be uncovered? Share this video with someone who believes true crime isn't just entertainment, it's a warning and a call for vigilance. And if you never want to miss the next hidden chapter of America's dark history, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you're always first to know. Because together, we're not just watching history, we're rewriting it one truth at a time.